So we've talked a little bit then about some of the advantages of disadvantages. Let's flip this to the other side. So a couple of years ago, Barry Schwartz and I sort of noticed as we looked across lots of different studies that in almost every domain we could find there was too much of a good thing.
Yeah.
That everything that we thought might be valuable, whether it's practice or generosity or pretty much any virtue, sort of if you got too much of it, turned negative. How does that figure into the story of David and Goliath?
Well, that paper you guys wrote was hugely. I gave you a little shout out in the book. It was hugely influential.
More than a little shout out, thank you.
No, it was hugely influential in my thinking. I read that paper and I was like, it's such a kind of, it's one of those, it's the best kind of insight. It is the most obvious, it's the thing your mom told you, right? Which is, there's such a thing as too much of a good thing, right? But it's also the thing that we cannot wrap our minds around. It's just, there seems to be, we understand linear relationships, we understand diminishing marginal returns. We cannot understand the idea of the inverted U, that the same thing that's positive at one level can turn negative at the other, with hugely deleterious consequences, I think. And I think that's the mistake that people in positions of privilege make. It's what dooms the favorite, is the favorite assumes that they can extend their advantages indefinitely. That if what makes me better than you at the beginning is that I have more resources, that if I keep spending resources, I'll always be ahead of you. And it's just not true. General Motors is not a better company, a more nimble, innovative company when it's the biggest, when it's at the height of its size and dominance in the 1970s. It's backed in profound decline. Microsoft is not more innovative today than it was when it was a fraction of its size. There are numerous. The American healthcare system is not better than other healthcare systems in the world by virtue of the fact that we spend 50% more per patient. In fact, I think you could almost very clearly make the argument our healthcare system is as bad as it is because we spend so much money. So there's I don't know, it's this sort of, I gave a talk once at Columbia Psychology Department when I was writing my book, in which I presented the problem and I asked the audience, since they were all psychologists, I said, give me reasons why we struggle with the inverted U. And it's very, that gave me so people just emailed them in. I got 50 of them. But it's a really, is it because on some evolutionary level, for most of our history, there was, because we never could get too much of a good thing, we never got to that part of the curve. If you're living on the savannah and there's a drought every 3 months, there's no such thing as too much food, right? So maybe that's just so baked into our system that maximizing surplus is the only way to get through life. That when you're in a world where all of a sudden surplus is not just attainable, but surplus in the Western world, surplus is a condition of our life, that we're just woefully unequipped on some level for dealing with that.
It's interesting, though, because when we're in the observer position, we have a different reaction. So we don't want to be the underdog necessarily, but we love to root for the underdog.
Yeah.
Why?
Well, I think this is paradoxical for the following reason. I understand on one level why, and that is because it is a way in which it's a version of the just world hypothesis. It is that the world seems more just to us if material advantage does not automatically translate to dominance. Right? So we need the belief that those without obvious resources can win in order for the world to seem fair. For the rest, for those of us who are, most of us, since most of us are not in a position of power, for those of us who are not in a position of power to feel we have a chance, right? So there's that. But the paradox is, of course, this is slightly tongue-in-cheek. It's why I don't cheer for the underdog. And that is that in a contest between a favorite and an underdog, if the underdog loses, the underdog feels very little distress because they expected to lose. If the favorite loses, he feels a great deal of distress because every expectation said he was supposed to win. The empathetic position then as an observer is to cheer for the favorite, right? Because if your job as an empathic human being is to want to minimize human suffering, the suffering comes when the favorite loses, right? So I remember as a kid watching sports. I remember it was one of the Olympic Games and I was cheering for a I'm a big track person, for an athlete who was one of my favorites, who was favored to win, and he lost. And I realized in that moment that the pain he felt was so much greater than the pain that those who never thought they were going to win would have felt had they lost. That there was from then on, I felt I have no choice as a human being but to root for the favorite. There's something to that, actually. It is weird because rooting for the underdog requires that we be indifferent to the emotional distress of the person who expected to win.
Potentially. Or is it that we expect the joy to the underdog and those rooting to outweigh the distress to the favorite?
Well, yes. So no, this is interesting. This gives you an insight into my psychology. I'm far more distress avoidant than I am joy seeking.
So bad is really stronger than good for you, as it so often is in psychology.
Yeah. The fact that the underdog is happy means very little to me next to the distress of the favorite.
Okay.
But you're right. You could have a completely, actually, it's so weird. I had never even framed it that way. That's how distress-oriented I am.